Hi everyone! We all know Godot is already really good for 2D games, but in terms of 3D, the opinions are mixed. Some people can make really good looking stuff with the 3.x versions, while many wait for Godot 4 and all its new 3D features. Well, I'm making a survival horror game similar to Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil and Silent Hill. And let me tell you, my problems have nothing to do with missing features. Sure, decals, particle physics and all that are great, but my problems lie with the workflow. So throughout this video, I'll present you with the problems I encountered and how I want to solve them by changing the workflow. Let's begin. I'm using Blender for creating my 3D assets. This means if I want to create levels, I have two basic options: creating most of the level in Blender versus creating most of the level in Godot. When I started my 3D project, I used to do most of the level design in Godot. I used Blender for asset creation only, meaning I even created rooms in Godot made of various cubes. This approach has one problem. Your scene tree will very quickly end up being overflooded with walls, collision bodies, etc. And because every asset model needs to be loaded separately, this can have an impact on loading times. The approach I then took was to not make assets in Blender, but complete rooms. So instead of having all these small assets in various different files, I'd have one big, complete 3D model per room with most smaller assets in it. That's great in terms of loading times and keeping a small scene node hierarchy. But of course, this approach has its own downsides as well. If you notice an error with an asset, like a missing face or a non-consistent edge, you'll have to correct it for every room separately, as the asset is part of that room. Unless of course you use Blender's link append feature. This might work, but for me this is adding another layer of complexity in the level design process. I want it to be simpler. So what will I do? I believe the solution is somewhere in the middle. So instead of doing level design in either Blender or Godot for the most part, I'll do the following. I create the basic room layout as a single 3D model. This includes windows and door openings, but not the door itself because it's interactable. That way I'm avoiding having those walls etc. as separate entities and can use one collision shape for the basic level layout. It's important to empathize the difference here. The previous approach was to have a room with many different assets in one file. But when loaded in Godot, these would still result in different mesh instances inside the according file's scene. What I'm doing now is to turn the room layout into a single mesh instance in Godot instead. In Godot, I'll then furnish the level with additional assets, like desks, etc. In case of the desk, for example, I'll also put smaller static assets on it in Blender. Again, this avoids having too many elements. In case I need both a cleaned up and an untidy desk, I'll use two exported versions of that Blender file asset in Godot, meaning two different exported model files. Unless it's necessary, my assets will be exported as OBJ instead of GLB. That way, it's easier to assign materials as I have to do less clicks. Also, because OBJs are mesh instances in the scene tree, I can easily create custom collision shapes for each asset. I can use the GLB file format for animated assets, like characters. This is sort of a middle ground between those two approaches I have tried in the past. By doing it this way, I believe I get the best result from both approaches without their downsides. I should be able to iterate on each asset on its own, if necessary, while also avoiding an unmanageable scene tree. But that's not the only problem I encountered when working with Godot and Blender. The next one is materials. Godot likes to take materials from an existing GRB file and show them in the file explorer. That itself isn't a bad thing. But if you have various different assets in different project directories, each asset will have its own material file in its subdirectory, even though they share a material in Blender. So you will end up with a lot of unnecessary copies, which you have to fix. If you are dumb, like me, and you use Ctrl+C and Ctrl+V to copy 3D objects in Blender instead of Shift-D, you will end up with even more copies of the same material. Yeah, I know, I really need to retrain my muscle memory. Anyway, I really hate materials because of these small inconveniences. And if you feel the same way, do the following. On your Blender export, go to Geometry, Materials and set it to No Export. Now you will have to assign the materials in Godot for the model. But given I only use like 2 materials per asset at most, this should be far less work than fixing already exported materials. I'm still figuring out how to improve the graphics of my game and become more efficient when creating new assets. Getting rid of all these hassles is a big step in the right direction. I hope me breaking down my workflow, the problems I have and how I intend to solve them was helpful. Thanks for watching and until next time, bye bye.